This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 377. Never too big to fail us.
This is, and you would have to agree, disastrous for Optus's corporate reputation after the data leak last year.
There is no relationship between the two. We operate a very reliable, very good service for our customers. We offer them great value. We offer unique services, and we pride ourselves on going the extra mile for our customers. So this is a very unusual occurrence. We're deeply sorry that it occurred, and we will do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, that was the CEO of Optus this last week. They are the second biggest phone and internet provider in Australia, giving the PR spiel after all their services, phone, internet, mobile phones, they all went down from early morning across Australia throughout the working day on Wednesday. It was late in the day before it was fixed, just days after water stopped reaching homes for days in parts of Surrey in the UK. And that's just this last week. So why are things that we used to rely on just not working as they should? Now, maybe we are seeing lots of innovation, but wouldn't we rather actually be able to rely on reliability rather than low prices and marketing babble? So what's gone wrong? Is it the lack of expertise, lack of money? Is it privatization? Is it underinvestment? Or is it politics? Whatever it is, there's something going badly wrong. And are we just seeing the start of it? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, in Australia this last week, they had an internet outage. Actually, they had an internet, phone and mobile phone outage, not just for an hour or so. I think it was about 12 hours in the end, during the day, middle of the week. It was only one network. It was the Optus network, but they account for a good third of all households and businesses in Australia. It started Wednesday about 4 in the morning. It lasted, I think, until about 5 in the afternoon. So millions of people were affected. Hospitals were hit. Melbourne's entire train network had to stop. Now, remember how last week I said everyone should read E.M. Forster's book, The Machine Stopped, which was written in the early 1900s. Well, the machine did stop in Australia this last week. So to talk about that and other cases where we have become very reliant on private companies for essential infrastructure, Steve and I are joined this week by Matt Tett, who is the founder, chair and CEO, basically the boss of everything at NX Test Labs in Australia, who test technology, and a lot of that is to do with telecommunications equipment that sits on networks. So, Matt, welcome to the podcast. What do you think went wrong with Optus?
Thank you, Phil. Well, something didn't go right. Let's just put it that way. So my first thought, being a former network and security engineer, was someone's pressed the wrong button. And sure enough, it sort of all indications now point to the fact that they had a bit of a mishap with their routing configuration tables, particularly using Border Gateway Protocol, which replicates, I guess, if you make a mistake, it's going to broadcast it to all the other routers. And if it's a big enough mistake, you're likely to crash the network and all the systems, which it's not just a simple fix like a content management system where you can log in and fix it. If you can't log in anymore because you've killed your network, you're actually going to have to get people boots on the ground to go and plug into the equipment.
So it's human error, because I mean we hear about redundancy built into networks, that nothing can go wrong because you've got redundancy, but the redundancy is the infrastructure, isn't it? I mean, you've got the technology that sits on top of it, and you've only got one set of technology which is controlling all of that, duplicated infrastructure.
Well, thinking about it the last 24 hours, you'd like to hope that such a major outage couldn't necessarily be caused by the failure of one human or the error of one human. So I'd say it's a multitude of factors which have led to this incident actually occurring, because you would imagine that most organisations, particularly organisations like Singtel, Optus, would have procedures and policies in place to check, double check and triple check systems before they go live, which is why there's probably a good chance that it might be one of their their peering partners, which has done it. But again, that's not letting anyone off the hook, because at the end of the day, regardless of who you're trusting, you've got to ensure that trust is well placed. And just 'cause someone else missed it doesn't mean you shouldn't miss it either. So
I've got this theory that when it comes to IT infrastructure, telcos really don't understand what they've got. And I'll give you an example. I was a customer of BT, a business customer of BT here in the UK. And they started, when I joined them, and I was, I'd switched to them from EE. So I was using exactly the same infrastructure, actually owned by the same company. But they somehow had this idea that I had requested 2 broadband lines attached to the same phone number, which clearly is not possible. But they started charging me for both. And then my network kept on cutting off and then starting again. They had someone coming out. I don't know how many times Openreach engineers came out because they thought it was a line fault. No one could really quite figure out until one of those engineers says, "Oh yes, I've seen this before. It's an IT problem where the infrastructure is confused by the fact you've got two connections, so it keeps on trying to switch between the two. Clearly, no one understands what they're working with. There's this. It is this." Because it's been built up over a long time, stuff is built on top of other stuff, and you just lose track of where you started from, don't you?
Legacy systems, yeah. Legacy systems are the bane of any ICT project issue. When you get to a certain size and scale like that of BT or Optus, you end up having to build on top of your legacy systems and hope that the middleware holds it all together. So a perfect example of that is, in the past, billing systems were completely separate and autonomous to their operational systems, but then someone probably thought it was a good idea one day to say, well, instead of manually or having different records, let's converge the two. And instead of going, we'll rebuild the billing system or rebuild the operating network system, they thought they'll build some middleware and put it together. Now, when someone accidentally, and you're right, human error, puts in the fact that you've got 2 services, and then the billing system competes with the operational system to say, no, this one, no, that one, it's a special individual case. So,
the easiest way, it seemed the only way of solving it in the end was actually to move companies, and the problem was, again, same infrastructure, so clearly it was an IT problem because the problem fixed itself. But Steve, I mean, we talk about companies being too big to fail. I mean, clearly that's a nonsense because lots of big companies have failed. But even so, even if they're not, even if they survive, that doesn't mean they're not too big to fail us. This was a bit of a calamity, wasn't it? And to make it worse, Optus isn't an Australian business anymore. It's entirely owned by Singtel, Singapore Telecoms, which is itself owned by a Singapore investment company that's got $400 billion in its portfolio, of which analysts believe Optus is worth somewhere between 8 and 12 billion. They know that because they want to basically hive it off and sell it on the ASX at some point. They might have delayed that now. So it's at best 1.5% of their portfolio. So actually, do they really care too much about this company that's not even, situated in the same country as they are and such a small part of their portfolio?
Yeah, that's a large part of the problem when you privatise something, and particularly when you allow international investors to buy it out. I mean, that's one of the jokes we've discussed earlier about the British rail system, where most of it has been privatised, and most of the so-called private owners are actually the state-owned rail companies of Europe, and it's a nice little money earning for them. But their orientation is in milking British consumers as much as they can, rather than maintaining the infrastructure. So this is a similar sort of thing in that sense.
But I mean, if it's critical infrastructure, should you nationalise it? Because maybe this is a warning. This was only one company. This was Optus. Yeah. If the entire country had been brought to a standstill, only a third of it was, as it is. So actually, maybe, question for both of you, maybe infrastructure competition is actually the safest way when we're dealing with what is critical infrastructure.
Well, you mean what, multiple infrastructure providers?
Yeah.
No,
so
I
Optus
don't.
Optus is running a network, Telstra's running a network, Vodafone. We've got so if one of them fails, at least we've got the other two to rely on.
But the problem is you can't switch across to them; they're competitors. So you can't say, "Oh, my Optus has failed." Instantly, Vodafone takes over. They're going to fight tooth and nail against that sort of arrangement. So you're not going to get alternative infrastructure systems seamlessly transferring from one to and the other one fails. The real problem here is that you have a company Well, there's several problems, but one of them is the lack of sufficient redundancy in the system, and that can happen with a private company in what has always been a private area. For example, Boeing. It's the Boeing 737 that started falling out of the sky a few years back. And what happened was, first of all, Boeing wanted to compete with, and this was competition led to the problem in some ways. Boeing was being outcompeted by Airbus. They needed a mid-scale jet to take the place of it. They decided to scale up whatever the previous model was. I think the 737 light to 737 heavy, let's say. And
737 MAX it was, wasn't it? Well,
they whacked.
And the fundamental problem with it was that if it wasn't, it was controlled by computers, wasn't it? It was front heavy. If it didn't have computers.
It wasn't just that. It was, first of all, it had to be controlled by computers because it was unstable. So when you design a plane, with a plane, you want to be able to, if the engines fail, it glides. That's what you want to have happen. And that was the case with the 737. The 737 MAX was too top heavy because of the larger engines, and therefore they compensated by computer software. But the real weakness, apart from that, and they should have told people about this, the competition drove them to bring in a machine which was unstable, which itself is a bad start. But the second thing they did, and this is the part which is quite ridiculous, and it shows the change from an engineering culture dominating Boeing to a management culture dominating Boeing. There have to be indicators at the front of the plane for the level of wind shear or whatever. I'm not sure what the actual technical thing, though, whether the nose was dipping too much and so on. And you normally think you'd have several of those. Apparently, they only had one. Now, all you have is one bird hitting that indicator, bang, it's gone, and suddenly you don't have a signal, and there was no way for the pilots to override a machine which was sensing that there was, since the sensor was gone, it was getting a signal you were in a nosedive, and then it started raising the plane up and you had a stall and a crash.
Yeah, so I mean, the old way used to be, of course, to over-engineer everything, didn't it? But that's not happening now.
Yeah.
Obviously not happening with Boeing. Well, maybe in a way it was over-engineered or over-complicated. But I mean, so is the answer that you privatize, that you nationalize these companies? I mean, that's not going to solve anything if you do that, is it? You'll just get the same thing done by the public sector.
I wouldn't nationalise Boeing, but I think the idea of national infrastructures, critical infrastructures being state-owned, one reason for doing that is that the state doesn't have a short-term profit motive. And if it was, and the trouble is, you have idiots running the government who think it's a business, who don't realise they can create money, and therefore think they've got to save money. And the way they'll save money is by doing the same thing private sector does, and for the same reason, which is slashing maintenance and slashing a redundancy. And therefore you get a more efficient system, which will fail. And the reality is you should think about what systems you simply do not want to have fail. And one of them, obviously, is the power system. And now telecommunications as well. And you mentioned when telecommunications dropped out, the train system stops. So you have you have to look at some parts of your overall productive system and say, what parts can we not allow to stop functioning at any point in time? And therefore, they are the sort of things you should be doing with state provision, and you should be paying what is necessary to maintain it. And often these so-called cost savings that come from going competitive are nonsense, because what you get rather than long-term maintenance, you get marketing. And so you get plenty of annoying bloody ads in a system which will crash on you.
Yeah, those marketing people have got a lot to answer for, haven't they?
So you're one of them, yeah.
I was one of them, exactly, in the telecommunications space. Well, so I know that, it's cutthroat and it's trying to get your cost margins down as low as possible, over-promising and under-delivering. That's the name of the game. So, Matt, your view then on, you've got several networks in Australia now. I mean, my point was, one of them fell over. At least you had the other two. And actually, Steve's saying, well, you can't switch between one and the other. In fact, they are actually discussing exactly that proposal, aren't they? Because, of course, we do have roaming. You move to another country, you've got roaming infrastructure already there in place so that you can switch from one network to another. And I know that's being discussed in Australia, isn't it, as perhaps then an answer to a problem like this?
Yeah, on cellular networks, obviously. So on mobile networks, you can certainly do that. But I think the question is, how critical is critical, and what is critical infrastructure? And the problem with industry in Australia and the government is it's all mired down in bureaucracy. So at the end of the day, you've got the industry arguing that they're not critical infrastructure, that they just provide entertainment services for their consumers and their subscribers, particularly their home ones, that the organisations that they're providing services to should have their own risk mitigation policy. So if you are a train network, then you should be deemed critical, and therefore you should have a backup, which may involve having a failover or redundant system, which is with another carrier. But then again, at what cost? So again, it comes back to that privatisation of systems or cost budget effectiveness. And it's really looking at that cost-benefit analysis and what the appetite for risk is. And coming back to the main point is, how big is too big to fail? I mean, who would have thought that a carrier would lose their entire network, that it would take out their mobile broadband services as well, and basically leave half the country in the dark. So, it's happened now. There's an example, is that everyone's waiting for a train wreck to happen before anyone acts. And you're right, they've always talked about having these different systems in place. But when it comes to mobiles, roaming, absolutely. I mean, and really for critical disaster recovery is where they've been talking about having that. So if a carrier's tower is taken out by a disaster, then the other carriers will step in and support to enable that roaming for the mobile phone. But at the end of the day, that's minimum bare level communication, which is voice, like radio communications for emergency services. Voice is a minimum. I don't think they're going to sit there trying to maintain broadband or internet services in some of those instances, and certainly wouldn't enable switching between the two. The other thing, when you were talking, Steve, I was thinking about in Australia, we have NBN, which is owned by the federal government, or it's an organisation which is founded by the federal government, which provides a wholesale backbone network, but that's literally the transport, the physical layer, not the transport. And that's the responsibility of the retail service providers, which sit on top of it. And of course, that was the Optus with their routing affected that as well. So if you can take down your whole IP network, you've basically got nothing to sell. And that's the biggest issue, whether it's critical, whether it's deemed critical infrastructure. I've sat through so many meetings with government agencies where they argue, we don't call it critical infrastructure, we call it systems of national significance. And again, it's just a play on words. It goes back to that marketing spin of saying, well, we don't want to be called critical infrastructure because it means we'll have a lot more regulatory burden, and we already have too much regulatory burden. It's like, well, how much is too much, and who's looking over what you're actually doing? Yeah,
and the problem with that regulatory burden as well is who's doing the regulation, and what are the regulations, and how are they policed? Because very often, just in the broader space of any public-private partnership, for example, I think, and Steve, your views on this, public-private partnership often is seen as a faster way of rolling out a piece of infrastructure, so the government doesn't have to do it. They get someone else who's an expert in it. But they don't regulate it because they don't quite know how to set the conditions, because it's not their game. The people who are managing it are not experts in that field, and there's not enough of them anyway. So, it's badly regulated.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the classic being with, if you look what's happened with the regulation of the banks in Australia, you have effectively regulatory capture. And it's just everywhere. Regulation only works if you've got somebody with an extremely big stick and a short temper, and that is not the sort of person who gets a job in a regulator most of the time. So and this has been a decay over time as well. If you look at the financial crisis, how many people went to jail in America because of the financial crisis? Zero. The one person who went there was the one you could not possibly not jail, which was Bernie Madoff. But if you go back to the 1930s, when you had even though that was after the bubble of the economy of the 1920s, you had a much stronger emphasis upon ethics at that stage. There was what's called the Pecora Commission, and that sent hundreds of people to jail for obviously fraudulent behaviour during the 1920s stock market bubble. So we've actually let this stuff decay over time, and it isn't just that private is better than public or vice versa. One's influenced the other in a downward spiral towards incompetence. So
are countries anywhere in the world now, with the exception perhaps of China, because they can do what they want, but in the Western world, are there any countries that are actually capable of delivering large-scale infrastructure projects? So, I think, Matt, the NBN is a great example of something that became hugely political. The idea that it started with the idea that you'd have fibre broadband, high-speed, very fast broadband to every single household in Australia. Maybe, a few people living on farms in the bush, they might be excluded, but generally everybody would have fibre everywhere. Which is akin to, the idea in the UK of HS2, which was to build a high-speed rail network down the backbone of Britain so you could link the north and the south with very regular services travelling at speed, but capacity was the main thing, linking London with Manchester and Leeds. That then became London and Manchester, not Leeds, and then that became London and Birmingham, and then actually we can't make it right into London, so we'll stop somewhere just outside. So a massive white elephant. So, it's like... it's all just too much for governments to get their heads around almost. And part of the problem with HS2, and I think this is part of the problem with the NBN as well, was because there wasn't the expertise in the government, they really couldn't keep a handle on costs and look at what was being done. If you're running one of these companies and the government is subsidizing you, obviously you are just going to, build the gold-plated solution, or at least suck up as much money as you can. And there's no one there to control it.
It's not the money, it's the time. And governments operate on their terms, 3-4 years. So you can't make a promise that in 10 years, 15 years, we'll deliver fibre to the premises to every single person in Australia, bar a few. You've got to do it incrementally. And that's when Malcolm Turnbull came in and said, let's do multi-mix technology for a start, and then aim to get fibre to the premises out over time. It's a 15, 20-year life cycle. It's not even about the amount of money. They know if there's enough consumers paying money to the RSPs will be paying the money back to NBN. And you see all the numbers at the beginning, 30 million, 40 million, 70 million, 90 billion. And now they've recovered back to about 30 billion, which I think they're about to write off, which to them it's acceptable over, those 15 plus years they've been doing it. And now they are running fibre out to where they can. So they haven't given up on the network build out, and maybe it is an overbuild because they've deployed infrastructure, 10 years ago that they're now replacing. But that's a normal infrastructure build. But if you had have made that promise to win an election, I don't think everyone would have laughed at you.
Oh,
so again, it's bureaucracy.
It isn't bureaucracy. That's politics, because you've left the guilty party out here. Yeah. Malcolm was being shafted by Tony Abbott, who wanted to shaft Kevin Rudd, and you had the conservative nutcase politician, that's Tony Abbott, telling a progressive nutcase politician, that's Malcolm Turnbull, to try to undermine a narcissistic politician, that's Rudd, in the other party, and have none of them knowing a damn thing about technology. And the tragedy was that if we'd actually lifted the original idea that Rudd had, it would have been cheaper. And yet Tony sold the whole thing. It's cheaper, and who needs high speed? We all need high speed, and it ended up being more expensive doing the so-called cheap way. So you've got people who don't understand or respect engineering making engineering decisions.
Exactly, but there it is the issue. It is politics getting in the way of what is fundamentally an engineering project, and it gets waylaid by that. Look, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a second, because there's another example closer to my home, which is unforgivable. Actually, even worse than that outage that you saw in Australia the other day, although affecting a smaller number of people, but a more essential service. So we'll come back and talk about that in just a second. It's the Debunking Economics podcast. Me, Steve Keen, Matt Tett joining us today on the podcast as well.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So an internet and phone outage in Australia. There's also been a shutdown of water supplies in parts of Surrey in the UK, just around the corner from where I live. Just a couple of examples of private companies failing to provide essential services. Is it the fault of privatisation, or do government-run organisations also have the ability to stuff things up? Of course they do. In fact, I suspect they might even be better at stuffing things up. We were talking about how politics gets in the way just before the break. Matt Tett and Steve Keen joined me on the Debunking Economics podcast this week. So, just around the corner from me, there's been a case of, for 5 days in some cases, Godalming, the whole town of Godalming, large parts of Guildford, were without water for the best part of 3 days for everybody last weekend. For
Thank God it was England rather than Australia.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Sorry.
but, yeah, because we don't wash. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. But they're still trying to fix it. They've got air pockets now because of the shutdown. 13,500 households were affected. The retail director at Thames Water said it was the result of one of the biggest storms they've had in a decade. I mean, how can you, a once in 10-year event, I mean, how can you engineer for things like that?
A system that can't cope with a 1 in 10-year event. Yeah.
So that is how under-engineered infrastructure is becoming. That is unforgivable, isn't it? And it is a privatised company that is heavily in debt. And I wonder whether, I mean, they're now going to shareholder stress because they need to raise more capital because they obviously need to put more into the infrastructure that they've neglected. I don't think they care too much about, those shareholders care too much about the good people of Godalming. They just want the whole thing not to be nationalised for a knockdown price. They want their shares to hold the value. And that is, that's where they are. An under-engineered solution, a company heavily in debt, and shareholders who obviously don't want to bail them out.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the story of privatising essential infrastructure. My favourite example is still what's called the Big Pong, speaking of Australia, which happened in South Australia when the sewage system was privatised, sold to a French company. And sewage, of course, sewage treatment uses ponds of bacteria to break down the waste, and the maintenance wasn't done sufficiently. So one day all the aerobic bacteria got destroyed, leaving only the anaerobic bacteria. And what you got was hydrogen sulfide. And the lucky thing about this for the residents of Adelaide was that the ponds were upwind. So you had, for a couple of years, Adelaide stunk, which some people might think is a permanent situation given the usual Australian city rivalries, but that was just appalling. And the reason was, with a profit motive in mind, one way to increase your short-term profits is not to do your long-term maintenance. And this is the problem with privatising, essential infrastructure. You don't necessarily want the profit motive to be running things which are absolutely critical and which have lifespans of, 50 to 100, 200 years. And that's what England is now suffering from because, you have sewage outfalls that are called rivers.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever there's a storm, because the treatment plants aren't able to cope with all the extra water. So actually, Thames Water was fined only 3.3 million, which seems quite, they got off quite lightly. In 2017, they pumped millions of litres of undiluted water into rivers. 1,700 fish were killed, maybe a few open water swimmers at the same time as well. They'll probably keep that quiet. But I mean, that was back then. I mean, it's happening all the time. But Matt, where do you draw the line? What do you think? I mean, we can talk about telecommunications, but in any industry, between what should be infrastructure that's owned by the government and where the level of competition should exist. So is the NBN, for example, as a core infrastructure, does it make sense that that's owned by the government?
Well, imagine if it wasn't. Imagine what the RSPs would be doing to each other. I mean, one of them would want to own it again. And then you end up with that monopoly, which you basically still got, but it's certainly led to healthy competition for the consumers, which is really what we need. People don't want to pay. They want to pay the amount that they're comfortable paying to get the service that they perceive they're getting, and don't want to pay more. And then it just trickles down from there. So I think having healthy market competition is good, but as I said, how critical is critical, and when should it be a no-brainer where people are regulated, the prices are regulated, and the services should be regulated. There should be supply, KPIs on the suppliers. There should be measurements that are made against them in terms of how they perform, and there should be performance indicators which they're enforced. And as Steve said, it should be a regulator with a big stick and a short temper. And unfortunately, we've got too much regulation with no teeth at all in Australia, even in telecommunications. There's so many silos in government in Australia. As I said, I work in the cyber industry as well, and you see exactly the same thing. Too many different departments, agencies all running off in the same direction with the same rope, and it ends up being like an elastic band. They're competing with themselves within within government. They're building their own silos, they're building their own empires, and they're not really serving the citizens, which is what their charter is meant to be. They've lost their way, and technology enables that because they can pass the buck, they can handball it and say, watching Netflix may not be as important as potentially calling my mother when she's having an emergency, a medical emergency. So, how do you separate those two when they're converged networks? It's all well and good for those that enjoy their streaming entertainment, but it's not very good for my mum when she's trying to make an emergency call. And, we had a universal service obligation. We had the 000 call, and that's just been diluted. Optus, that's a perfect example of when too much technology convergence can make too much of an issue, and the government's let them get away with it. And I'm sure the government know that they're just as much on the hook as Optus are, which is why the minister's calling for answers so they can, I'm sure, put together their response to it as well. And I can't imagine that there's going to be any. There might be head rolling, but I can't imagine that there's going to be any major reforms or funds going one way or the other, because all the other telcos know that they're probably in exactly the same boat, and they'll all be lobbying against it.
So the Optus network. So I mean, the mobile network is a different thing, obviously, but the Optus fixed line network was obviously sitting on the NBN, wasn't it? So this is
all, yeah.
So the government is providing the infrastructure at a certain level, and it's all the stuff that's put on top that's enabling the transmission across that, which can still fail. So the government is stopping someone digging up, cutting a pipe in half, and making sure that level things are functioning correctly. And I guess that's the critical level, isn't it? Because so long as they can do that, that stops all networks going. Maybe that's enough. So does that mean?
But then that's just the internet. I mean, if you have a look at it, it's at the end of the day, the convergence with the telcos is that they all use IP transit as their backhaul. So from their so you can still connect to the local cellular tower, but that tower can't connect back to your network. And so that was the issue that Optus came across. If they had a separate backbone for their mobile phone network, say with another carrier or something like that, then their mobile phones would have still been up, but it was their network, and everything went down. So, and again, with NBN, yes, they are looking after the physical, and that is kind of their get out of jail free cards, I guess, is where they say, well, it wasn't a physical fault with the actual hardware, but who looks after the configurations? Yeah, they might have some certain expectation that the carriers know how to configure their networks and run them effectively, but at the end of the day, who's checking the checkers? Who, it just doesn't happen. So,
but isn't that the best hybrid model, Steve? Where, because it's the same as like that. I know you're not a big fan of the rail networks in the UK, and I don't blame you. But it's a similar model in that the government maintains the railways. Badly, as it turns out, because they're not very good at it. And in fact, a lot of the problems that are hit by the retail operators that are running trains along those lines are problems with the actual rail infrastructure, which the government is maintaining. So that's a bit like the NBN. So you've got the government is maintaining the core infrastructure. What's put across the top is open to retail players, and they're providing competition. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, it's often, as you said, that we've got two parts of the system that are both trying to do things badly, both of them believing they're trying to save costs. So government, which doesn't have to save money, believes it has to save money and therefore underdoes the underlying infrastructure. So in Australia, you get this ludicrous idea of a mixed optical fibre with copper, which was put across as saving money when you didn't need to save it because the government creates money by its own spending, and B, it gave you a far less effective system, so you had low quality coming out of the government and therefore more likely to break down. And then I don't mind having the competitive services on top of that system, but you then have, again, probably cost savings inside inside their system, so you get a lack of redundancy for systems which have to have redundant capacity. And like the rail system in the UK, I mean, I laugh at the train carriages over there. And the comparison to make is, as much as it's still got its own problems, look at the European system. And the European system, you have public ownership of the infrastructure and of most of the rail companies. There are some private, but most of them are state owned, and they provide high quality in both cases. It's like passing from the 19th to the 21st century to make a trip from English rail system to the European one. And which one had the more publicly based one? It's the European. So this myth that going to the private sector, well, the argument that going to the private sector would improve everything because they're more efficient and profit is a better motivator than public service, just turned out to be wrong. And we're stuck with the result of a dysfunctional ideology combined with people who've lost the engineering skills that used to be commonplace 40 or 50 years ago.
So, Matt, if we went back to a future where, we basically there's this vertical integration, it's all publicly owned, that would be a step back, wouldn't it? I mean, we'll be back in the infrastructure, in the Australian space, we'll be back to Telstra owning everything.
Yeah.
But owned by the government.
Telstra. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, look, they didn't do a terrible job, but they also didn't do an efficient job. And I think that's the key. When the government stepped in and tried to develop the NBN, as I said, it wasn't money. It was driven by time and how quickly can you get the numbers. I want to make a promise that I can get 80% of the country covered by this new NBN one way or the other, regardless of how poor the service quality is or how poor the different technology types are. But that's what I want to promise, and leveraging what's already there instead of wholesale replacing it. And it's taken that much longer to get to the point of where we are now. So, even if oh God, imagine if NBN became a retailer. It's just the model that they've got to have retail service providers on top does work to some extent, but again, it's the quality of those retail service providers and the service levels. I think some of the carriers actually rely on the fact that the consumers are willing to waive their service guarantees. And the fact that you can actually ask a consumer to sign a form to say, I understand that I'm getting a better price and therefore I waive my guarantees is, I just can't believe that a regulator would let a carrier get away with that.
So what they're saying, basically saying, pay less and we'll give you a shoddy service because we won't invest in the infrastructure.
Yeah, it's the old mentality with the days of dial-up. I mean, we ran Australia's third largest ISP in the days of dial-up, as you know, and we had 80,000 subscribers, and we had we were doing virtual operations for some of the smaller ISPs that couldn't afford the points of presence, and there were a number of them that actually ran two services identical. That there was literally no difference, except on their billing system, one person would pay, $12.99 and the other person would pay $19.99, and theoretically the $12.99 service was less than the $19.99 service, but they were identical. And so it was all about the consumer money, who was prepared to pay what. Do you think you're getting a premium service because you're paying slightly more? Internode, iiNet with the data, I mean, we used to have to pay for data, so you'd sort of offer more services, more data, and therefore a higher price. But in reality, your transit costs are still the same, particularly when peering comes into play. So,
I've been in that game, as you know, Matt, charging people for different levels of data and actually charging a little bit more for way more data that, in those days people weren't going to use, but the perceived value of what they were getting, even though they didn't use it.
Well, and the ones that did, you'd churn them. So,
exactly. Get rid of them. Too expensive. Yeah. So even back in those days, we were. I mean, everything was sailing close to the wind because it's a low margin game. So and still is, of course. Yeah, all around the world. But I mean, it's not just in that space. So Steve, is the problem, whether it's publicly owned or privately owned, that we just are not investing in the infrastructure in a way that's needed? So I'll give you an example of what happened with Centrica. When they privatised gas in the UK, one of the first things Centrica did was to close their gas storage. They had a 30 square kilometre reservoir under the North Sea. It could hold 600 billion cubic feet of gas, but it was closed in 2017 because it was too expensive. The government refused to provide the support that they needed to maintain it. And why would they maintain it? Because all it's going to do, obviously, when demand is high and supply is low, is reduce prices because they'd still have a gas supply. So the UK now has 2% related to gas demand, 2% storage, whereas in Europe they've got north of 20%. So now the government has said, well, we think you should reopen this gas field. They'll provide some support for it, but they're only going to open 5% of what it was before. And the reason, Centrica say, is because they are worried that down the track there will again be lack of government support. So the same thing could happen again. So this is a problem, isn't it? And that points to a few things. One, the profit motive for Centrica is why they closed it down in the first place. Secondly, when the government is saying, well, we'll pitch in, they're saying, well, we don't believe you, because this gets back to the whole political thing. There could be a change of government and that commitment could disappear. So they don't want to make the investment, which is a bit like, the shoddy rolling stock on the trains in Britain, because they know that after 6 years or whatever it is, they're going to have to renew their license. So why make the investment when their future is so uncertain? And that is the problem when you've got public and private partnerships like this.
Yeah, there's all been a con job. I mean, it's basically ideology dominating policy. And this is such a decay from how we were in the immediate post-war period, where the emphasis was on providing the best quality you could give to people who'd experienced the horrors of the Great Depression and the Second World War. And then the ideology of neoliberalism has come through there and saying, let's do the cost-benefit analysis, blah, blah, blah. And this is all short-term thinking. And there are some things, rail, gas, power, sewerage, telecommunications now, where you want reliability. That's the absolute first priority. And that has been killed by neoliberalism that doesn't have any concept of the different time spans of, selling a hamburger down the road versus enabling 24-hour operation of power systems, so you don't suddenly have power being turned off to an iron and steel factory, and then bang, you've got a blast furnace you have to throw away. So both public and private has been degraded by this attitude that we've got to focus upon minimising cost.
Right, but how do we fix that issue? Because you can't nationalize everything, and and particularly in areas where there's a need for speed, like for example, as we move towards net zero, and a lot of infrastructure needed for that. We can't have the government building all of the wind farms that are needed, for example. They're going to need to somehow rely on the private sector to do a chunk of that work. So what's the the optimum model moving forward?
Well, I think it's too late to move forwards on that front. I think what we've been doing is denigrating the importance of a long-term perspective in engineering. And what we've got is a short-term perspective in marketing, and that that would work if you got a blackboard economy, not a real one.
So sack all the marketing people to start with. That's easy, isn't it? Matt, what do you see as being the ideal hybrid model where we've got we're using government money to its most effective way, still got to have that impetus, that drive, which probably isn't going to come from the government.
Yeah. Steve said it before. It's all politicking with a K, and I mean that's the issue. Is the more bureaucracy feeds upon itself, the more those silos get built, and how do you deconstruct them? Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-government, and I'm certainly not anti any of the individuals in the government. We do the majority of our work with government departments and agencies, and there are some good people in there, but sadly there are quite a number which just drive their own agendas, and we've seen it time and time again over the last 30 years that we've been working in our field of independent testing. We come across it. The people that are anti-independent testing are the ones that don't want to know the truth. They don't want to know the facts about the technologies that they're looking at investing in. They just want to spend the money or get the result without spending money. So, it's a catch-22 situation. As you're talking before about infrastructure and the poor levels of maintenance and engineering, road systems are a perfect example of it. I mean, the state of the roads currently in Victoria, where I live, is absolutely abysmal, and all the local government agencies and the Road Transport Agency are blaming the weather. It's like, well, it goes back to that 10-year, once in a 10-year sort of thing. The roads have been there a lot longer. It's maintenance and keeping it up before they deteriorate too much. And if they're not spending the money, they are going to deteriorate, and it's going to cost them more in the long run. But they know they're only going to be around for 3 to 4 years, and it's going to be someone else's problem down the track. And you have multiples of that. It's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, the potholes get really bad here during winter, which obviously, how can that be foreseen? That's a once in a year event. But here, fortunately, the cancellation of a large part of the HS2, Rishi Sunak is going to that forward-thinking project. Rishi Sunak is going to spend 10% of that fixing potholes. So that's progress for you. But Steve, maybe the answer is that you hive off some of this responsibility away from government, some of these long-term projects. So, you know how, the NHS is not the most efficient organisation, but it is sort of untouchable. The Conservatives are trying to, bit by bit, chip away at it to privatise it, but they're not going to have a great deal of success with that. So the NHS runs as a separate entity funded by the government. It's got experts. It's got, people who understand medicine who are running it. Maybe we need more of that sort of stuff. I mean, people would unkindly probably call them quangos, but maybe we need to do the same for energy. We need to do the same for transport. Just hive them off and have an untouchable budget and dedicated experts who are actually running these critical parts of our countries.
Yeah, that's getting away from politicians and ideology dominating decision making. When you're going to have the point that neoliberals would make back is, you maybe too much money, they'll always expand their own costs, etc., etc. We've got to monitor them to maintain their costs, to minimise their expenditure. But this has been done with an ideology focus and not a quality of life focus. And spending as much time as I do in Asia at various times, you see that the European countries and American are dominated by sort of a marketing and a bean counter attitude towards everything, whereas in countries that are still trying to establish a decent level of living and infrastructure, you've got a sort of state, an attitude that the state is trying to construct the system, is trying to build a nation, and consequently you get far better infrastructure in Asia, particularly in China, than you find in Europe, and that's a sign of just how the cost cutting and profit maximising attitude that dominates the West is actually leading to its decay.
Also, because they don't have the legacy to contend with, so building from scratch is always a good position to be in, isn't it? Look, we'll leave it there for now. I'm not sure we've solved anything. As always, we've highlighted a problem. Maybe we're part of the way towards finding a solution, but it's always good to talk about it anyway. Matt, great to have you on. I haven't spoken to you for years, so I've enjoyed talking to you. Good to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for that.
All right, and thank you, Steve. Catch you next time.
Thank you, Matt. Bye.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.